Okay, I don't think we want to hold off too much longer. So without further ado, let's begin. So welcome to the fourth and final in our series of the Higher Education Students Early Statistics Survey webinars, which we'll be calling HESES from here on out. These webinars are largely intended for people who are completing the HESES survey for the first time, or for those who need a bit of a back to basics refresher. If you've missed our previous sessions, we'll show you where to find them in a moment, but I'm just going to start with a bit of housekeeping for this webinar. So my name is Will Awad, and I work as the funding round manager in the funding round team at the OFS. If my link goes down, my colleague Roger Lear will step in to take over from me, and my other colleague Graham Price will be joining a bit later to respond to your questions. We have turned on the live transcription feature in Zoom, so captions are available by clicking on the CC icon. It's important to note that the captions are automatically generated, so there may be some errors in what's displayed on screen because of some of the jargon that we have to use. Unfortunately, we can't avoid this, but we'll do our best to be as clear as possible. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. You'll be able to find the link to the recording via the events page of our website, a link for which I'll show you in a moment. As before, the intended audience for this session is very much those who have not come across HESES before, or those wanting a refresher. And at any point, you can submit questions to us, and we'll pause a few times through this webinar to answer these as we go. When you're submitting questions to us, please can you use the Q&A function rather than the chat feature, which is really only for use for contacting our events team. We're scheduled for about 90 minutes, but we have some flexibility over this. And of course, if we can finish early, we will. We do have an evaluation form that we'll send out to participants who have agreed to receive one after the events. But if you have any comments before then, please do write to us, and I'll share an email address for that in a moment as well. So as I said, this is our final live event of the year, but recordings of the other events can be accessed on the OFS website. To find them, go to www.officeforstudents.org.uk/events, where you can find all of the details. We've produced a number of supporting documents to help providers who will be completing the HESES data survey, most of which can be accessed through the main HESES page on our website, which is found at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. In particular, can you make sure to consult the HESES24 guidance? This can be found in the publications section of our website, or also at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES24, spelt HESES24. This document sets out the rules and definitions you will need to use when returning your HESES data. If you're new to HESES, we also have a Completing the HESES24 workbook publication, which is set to be published over the coming next few days. And this is basically a beginner's guide to how to complete the workbook. Similar supporting documents on multiplication factors and submitting the representations can be found under the Multiplication Factors tab of the data collection pages. The full URL is there, but if you go to www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, spelled HESES, you'll be able to find the tab within there to find the multiplication factors. For a more general overview of OFS funding, we've also published the Guide to Funding for 2024-25, which is on the OFS website. And lastly, if you want to stay informed about the OFS announcements, including those relating to funding, you can sign up for our email alert service, which is www.officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts. And that last bit, sign up for email alerts, is all hyphenated. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to have a look at how to submit your HESES24 workbook, how to upload and complete the workbook, and the submission on the portal itself. We'll then go on to how the OFS will carry out data verification on your return. As part of this, we'll look at how you can help to streamline this process for both you and us. We'll also look at how to get your HESES24 submission signed off. This is what we're all aiming for, so this is perhaps one of the most important parts of the whole process. And finally, we're going to look at multiplication factors and submitting representations. This is how we ultimately translate years of engagement into full-time equivalent values, which are used in our funding methods. So let's start by looking at the submission of your HESES workbook. We'll set the scene by looking at the overall HESES timeline. As you can see from this table on screen, the workbooks will be available to download from the portal in late October. You can also see the census dates, which is a concept that we talked about in our second live webinar. And you can see that this is either the 1st of November or the 1st of December, according to the type of provider involved. In terms of submitting your workbook and what happens after that, you need to know the deadline dates for workbook submission. And you can see from these slides that these are either noon on the 13th of November for further education and sixth form colleges and academies, or noon on the 11th of December for all other providers. So that's the 13th of November and the 11th of December. We generally do not allow extensions to this submission deadline, so please make sure you can submit before the deadline. If necessary, changes can be made before sign-off during the data verification process. As you can see, submitting your workbook is not the end of the process. HESES data verification is the second part of this presentation, and it carries on until the sign-off deadline, which this academic year is the 31st of January 2025, by which time we expect that all HESES returns will be signed off, and we'll be looking at the process for this a bit later. This year, we have integrated the multiplication factors representation process into the timetable, the deadline for which is the 14th of February 2025. However, the final HESES24 sign-off deadline remains the 31st of January, as stated in the F3 notice issued to your provider, and we'll talk about how these interact a bit later. Submitting the HESES workbook is done via the portal. Why? Well, because it's a secure, controlled method of sending and receiving workbooks. Please do not send the HESES workbooks by email. Aside from the fact that email isn't a wholly reliable medium, especially with attachments, its security isn't great. So for providers that must fill in the courses table, certain circumstances could conceivably lead to individual students being identified. For this and other reasons, it's better that everyone uses the same method, which is the most secure method of transfer. If you find that you need to send us additional information, that could be sensitive, please contact us and we'll arrange a secure method of transfer for the information. You can access the portal at this web address here, and I'm going to read it out in full because it's all important to accessing it. So it's https://extranet.officeforstudents.org.uk/data. Now, the whole URL there is important for accessing the portal, so please make sure you're using that exactly. In this session, we're only going to touch on the use of the portal a little bit, as we have other resources available which you can reach on the website. These again can be found at officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. Appendix 1, which again is due to be published over the coming days, is a document that spells all the information out about submitting your workbook and interacting with the portal. It's called Downloading and Submitting HESES24. These resources all have the detail, but we'll spend a few moments just touching on some important points, which will also help you in terms of downloading the workbook as well. So if submitting your HESES return this year will be the first time you're accessing the OFS portal, you'll need to make sure you are registered with your portal provider. You'll need to make sure you're registered on the portal as a user for your provider. Once registered, assigned to the HESES24 survey area, you'll be able to navigate to there to upload your HESES24 workbook. You'll also be able to download it from the same location. If you're not registered, you will need to ask the portal administrator at your provider to create an account for you. They will also be able to assign you to the HESES24 area. If you are unsure who your user administrator is, but you are a registered portal user, you can view the portal administrators at your provider by logging into the portal. Otherwise, if you can't log in and you don't know who the administrators are, please contact us using the email address portal@officeforstudents.org.uk. The document just referred to as well can describe these steps in more detail, so please refer to that if you need. In terms of submitting the workbook, I won't spend too much time on how to use the portal for this, because there's more detail in the appendix already mentioned. So for a quick overview, to start the upload, navigate to the correct area of the portal and click Upload, and you'll be prompted to locate your file and set the process in motion. It's worth saying that this is a single thread process on the portal, so you may have to wait in a queue, but you can log off and return later if you wish. Also note that on deadline day, waits can be fairly long, so please don't leave it right to the last minute if you can avoid it. When it comes to amending your workbook, you can, if you wish, upload your workbook before the census date, but any submissions before the census date are invalid. After the census date, you can upload as many workbooks as you wish until the submission deadline. We'll always take the latest upload as the one to be used for data verification. If you have managed to modify the workbook in some way, your workbook will not be accepted, but hopefully this shouldn't occur as we have put protections in place on all the relevant areas. When the upload is complete, check the outcomes and comments fields referred to in Appendix 1 of the guidance if needed. If there are errors in the workbook, it will not be accepted, and you'll have to correct this before it will be accepted as a valid submission. After submission, click on Results to download what's referred to as the results package. This is a zip file, and we'll look at this in a moment. And please note that only the person who uploads the workbook can download the results package, so ensure it's stored in a safe and secure place available to all those who need access to it. Please see our website. It's all described in Appendix 1. As noted before, you can find this at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. So the results package is a zip file, and it contains a version of your workbook with your submitted data and automatic highlighting applied to some of your tables. You'll find that some information will have been added or amended on the information page, which we'll see in a moment. But effectively, we add the submission date and the submission number. This workbook from the results package will be the one we use for data verification. So you should download the results package to a safe place, accessible to all likely to need it, and use a copy of this for any revisions that may prove necessary. Remember, only the person who uploaded the workbook can download the results package. And in any case, it's a good idea to have more than one person working on HESES, so there are no single points of dependency. This is particularly important and is especially important through the verification process because it takes place over the holiday period in winter. So make sure that your college or university has another student data contact if possible. So this here is the top part of the information tab in the workbook. And you can see the useful submission information I was just describing, namely the submission date and the submission number. These get filled in after each submission to the portal. Underneath these, you'll see the workbook checks shown here. You should check the information in it before submitting your workbook. This summarizes issues or potential issues with the data in your workbook. You can see that these are classified as validation checks, which we'll have a look at in a moment, credibility checks, and the comparison table highlighting. We'll have a look at all these again in a bit more detail, as you're likely to be asked about the comparison table highlighting and credibility checks in data verification. New this year, we also have multiplication factors representations checks. We'll discuss this again in more detail a bit later, but these validation errors will show when a representation has not been completed correctly. Here's the bottom half of the information tab. This one in particular is from the HESES24 workbook, but the HESES24 workbook will follow the same structure. I want to show this to you so you can see the notes and guidance, and below that, we can see a particular version of the workbook. This one is a template that's being used and the notes that relate to the latest changes. This is useful if there are any changes made. So let's have a look now at those validation checks I just mentioned. You shouldn't be attempting to submit a workbook that has validation errors. But if validation errors are present in a submitted workbook, the results package workbook will have an extra sheet called validation, which will detail the specific problems. Validation errors will also be flagged in the tables in which they occur, with the relevant values turning red and validation failure appearing above the column. While your workbook can still be submitted, if it is invalid, we will not accept it as a valid submission. The errors that are being triggered must be resolved before workbooks will be accepted as valid submissions. So let's see a quick example. Remember, validation errors occur where data is not feasible rather than just being unlikely. In this example here, a negative number has been entered in a workbook cell that cannot be negative. Entries in column 2 cannot be negative as they count years of engagement. As you can see here, this will be highlighted in red. On the workbook itself, above the appropriate column, and below or to the side of the table in question, and as shown previously, the presence of validation errors will be shown in the Information tab. Once errors have been resolved, the amended workbook should be resubmitted to the portal, and the new version of the results package should be downloaded. So we see this reflected in the information sheet, and it will show no validation errors. Okay, that was quite a lot of information in one go. So I'd like to invite Graham to join me now, and we're going to go through any questions that have come in. So Graham, are you there?
I am, if the video catches up with the audio.
Wonderful.
We haven't had any questions submitted yet as part of the webinar, but we did have some questions submitted ahead of the session today. So I'll run through those at this time. We have had some questions about the derivation of the multiplication factors and obviously how that'll work with HESES24 data. And as my colleague Will outlined, there will be more on this later in this webinar session. And there will also be more available on the HESES support pages on our website, both in Appendix 6 and on the multiplication factors section of that. So obviously, once this webinar has finished, we recommend going to go and review those. And obviously, if there are any questions, we've made available the relevant email addresses to contact the team on, and we are happy to help. We have had a question from someone asking what common issues occur for providers. Unfortunately, we at the OFS aren't best placed to respond to that one, because obviously we only engage with a small part of the process where providers either engage with submitting the workbook or through the data verification, which will be covered in a bit. What we usually recommend is making contact either with colleagues at other providers or with contacts at sector bodies who may be able to open up channels of discussion with colleagues at other providers, because they will be best placed to advise on that, or even if you're using particular software, contacting the software team for your student record systems, who may be able to, they will likely, if you've had any particular issues, any of those particular contacts may have experienced it and be able to advise. Next question we've had about how to submit your completed HESES workbook. As Will's already covered this just now, so hopefully that's provided the relevant information, and also as set out, the information will be available in Appendix 1, which we will hopefully be publishing imminently. We're in the process of finalising a few documents to go up on the supported HESES pages. So again, review what's available when it's available. And if you've got any particular questions, make contact with us on the emails provided. We have had a question about how verification will be communicated. This will be covered later in this webinar. So hopefully that will provide the information you need. But if following that you have any particular questions that you need expanding on about the verification process, either fire it into the Q&A box and I'll pick it up in the next Q&A session, or again, contact us by email and the team is here to help.
Great, thank you very much, Graham.
I've got a couple more if needed.
I think, well, I was going to say on that,
I've just been
messaged. Yeah, I've just been messaged to say that there are some problems with the Q&A feature at the moment. We don't know why, and we are aware of it. So after saying, please use the Q&A feature, if you can, please continue to use that feature in Zoom. But if you're having problems with it, please do put questions in the chat and we'll pick them up and go through there. So, Graham, I wonder if we just give it a few minutes and we'll come back at the next round. So
I will pick the next ones up in the next round then.
Yeah, to give the Q&A some time to hopefully sort itself out. But thank you very much.
No worries. Back to you.
Wonderful. Well, apologies that there do seem to be some issues with the Q&A. We'll try and get that sorted. But I'm going to move on for now and look at how the OFS will carry out data verification on your HESES return. So straight into the question that was asked in advance. So after you've submitted and the submission deadline has passed, we'll move on to the DV verification itself. So we call data verification DV for shorthand. Once we've received the uploaded data, we will start examining it to determine if we have any queries about it. Practically, all providers will receive queries on their data, and it's an iterative process with multiple rounds of queries. Each provider will work with our data verification team, and our first round of queries will be emailed to each provider's student data contact. There'll also be attached a series of documents, including a letter with full instructions on the DV process, the data verification queries, which we also refer to as DVQs, and these will list your specific queries, and a deadline for receiving a response, which at the beginning is likely to be 5 working days. I'll show an example of this in just a moment about how the data verification queries work and how you respond to them as a provider. So naturally, we expect providers to follow best practice when compiling and submitting data, because this is used to determine funding as well as for other planning purposes. And for those reasons, it's important for us to use robust data assurance processes. So the data verification is really the first step we take to ensure the data supplied to us is fit for purpose. Other activities such as audits or data reconciliations may take place at a later date, but for now we're focusing on the DV process. It's important to note that where a provider fails to submit data on time or returns data that is not credible after verification, we may allocate funds based on our own estimates of student activity. We do reserve the right to use our own estimates of data where we have reason to believe provider data is not fit for purpose, and we also reserve the right to review funding allocations for the most recent 7-year period. So what we're looking for when it comes to HESES is the best possible representation of your higher education provision. This allows us to make accurate grant allocations. Data verification allows us to be confident in the accuracy of your data, be confident in the robustness of your data process, identify any large or unexpected changes compared to previous years, and understand the context of your data, which is effectively how HESES relates to what's happening with your provision. Notice that it's common for us to ask queries of most or all providers. It's our first step in the due diligence process, and as just mentioned, things like data reconciliation and audit may also follow. It benefits us for all these reasons, and hopefully, as providers, you'll find the exercise useful also, because it should give you an opportunity to think about how your provision is changing. So we base our queries primarily on what we call first stage credibility warnings and comparison table highlighting. First stage credibility warnings may occur where the data in the workbook is possible, but seems unlikely or unusual. So we'll look at an example of that in a moment. Comparison table highlighting is where what we mentioned earlier, but we haven't said much about it till now. They're not something that you need to enter data into. They're automatically filled when the workbook is filled out by you. And we'll talk about the highlighting on them in a moment as well. For now, we'll just say that this is where we find greater than expected changes in data compared to previous years and other sources. As noted before, these are listed on the information sheet. We may base queries on other relevant issues as well, so these won't necessarily be highlighted in your workbook, but might just be things that we come to our attention through the process. By asking these data verification queries, it doesn't mean that we think your data is wrong, it's just unexpected. If the changes are large, we would expect a more detailed explanation for the differences. Just to give you an idea of what we're discussing here, let's have a look at credibility warnings and comparison table highlighting a little bit more closely. So first stage credibility warnings occur when data is possible but appears unusual. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong. It's just considered, and it's not considered incorrect. Rather, the basis of this and the data we have available to us suggests that we are just not sure quite how things have come about. The data itself that you have submitted to us differs from what we might expect. As an example, consider a workbook where all students are recorded as new entrants on table 5. This may be accurate for a new provider, but for most, it's not what we would normally expect to see. Credibility warnings will be highlighted above the relevant column and below the table. Workbooks with credibility warnings will be accepted as submissions, but these almost certainly will be queried during the data verification process. So you should investigate the underlying cause. Submissions of initial explanations can help to speed up the verification process, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. If we have a quick look at the comparison tables, these appear towards the end of the HESES workbook. Their contents are automatically generated from the data entered into it and other sources of individualized data. Because there are several variants of these tables, it's not worth giving a specific example of highlighting in them, but you'll probably notice these when preparing your workbook for submission. This is just an illustration of the type of thing you might see. The point to remember here is that the type of highlighting appears if comparisons made in these tables extend beyond predefined thresholds. All of the parameters and thresholds used for these are outlined in the appendices that we referred to earlier. Again, this does not necessarily signal that there's anything wrong with the data or that it's considered incorrect, just that it's not what we might expect given what we know. A workbook with comparison table highlighting is valid for submission and is likely that the highlighted fields will be queried in the data verification process. So before you upload to the portal, please check the reasons for the highlighting, and if possible, detail these by submitting initial explanations to dataVerification@officeforstudents.org.uk. Now, don't worry if you have lots of highlighting. If your data is accurate, we won't necessarily need to query every single bit of highlighting. Lots of it may be related, and you can point this out to us in your initial explanations, which can be really helpful. So focusing now more on the mechanics of data verification queries, you may hear us refer to the DVQ template. It's a Microsoft Word document. It contains all the details for the queries and the provider responses, and it's exchanged by email between the data verifier and the person at each provider who is nominated as the student data contact. This happens throughout the verification process. We strongly recommend that each provider nominates more than one student data contact to avoid single points of dependency due to holidays or unscheduled absences. Please write to HESES@officeforstudents.org.uk to nominate another colleague in this role. Remember to get your local user administrator to set them up on the OFS portal. And as we have said before, it's a good idea to save the workbook and the correspondence where other team members can access it if required, as only those who upload the workbook can download it. These factors are particularly important because of the tight timetable for data verification. So on this slide, you'll see what we refer to as the DVQ document, and we're going to have a look at the process. This is just one page from the Word document that I just described that's exchanged between data verifiers and student data contacts throughout the verification process. We don't show it here, but it starts with a section for queries on first stage credibility warnings. Its format is almost identical to what you see here from the following section for queries on the workbook's comparison tables. Specifically here, we see questions on comparison table H, which is the proportion of new entrants on table 5. We won't show the comparison table itself here or the highlighting on it because we just want to show you the format of the DVQs. Under the heading table row, the relevant place on the table is identified. In this case, the row for full-time and sandwich year out, undergraduate, home fee students. In the next column, headed query, we see the reason and the highlight. We see the reason for the query and the highlighting, and then the data verifier's request for further details. Note that the queries are dated. This is really important as it helps us keep track of things. And please date your own responses when you are responding in the adjoining column. This makes it much easier to reference between queries and responses. To further assist this, if there's more than one exchange, data verifiers will often color the text of their queries to help distinguish them from each other. It's helpful if providers can mirror this and use the same colors. Finally, once a query has been successfully answered, the entire row will be shaded gray to show that it has been completed. The most frequently asked DVQs focus on things like changes to the proportion of students by price group, mode of study, and fundability status. And essentially, we're asking, how has your provision changed? In terms of responses to DVQs, we're looking for responses that directly relate to the query raised. If it's related to another query, you can also cross-reference your responses if it's appropriate. And we're looking for responses that have an appropriate level of detail and that show an understanding of the HESES definitions. Newcomers to the DV process sometimes find it tricky to get into the right process and giving us the right answers in terms of what we need to look for in what you're responding to us. Asking yourself, how has your provision changed, is a really good way to start. As just noted, a single underlying issue may be the reason for more than one query. Please feel free to cross-reference and link your responses accordingly and review your responses from previous years as these may still apply. As mentioned on the previous slide, please date your responses and match color coding if it's used. Before sending back your responses, please check that you have responded to all the queries raised. It often happens that the DV process highlights the need to make changes to your workbook. If this is the case, in the first instance, please contact your data verifier who'll be able to assist you. Email your responses to dataverificationofficeforstudents.org.uk. And please respond within the deadline set when the DVQs are sent to you. Initially, this is 5 working days, but as the DV process continues, because there are several rounds and it will get close to the sign-off deadline, these may become shorter. I've mentioned initial explanations twice now, so let me describe them a bit more fully. They're effectively preemptive responses to data verification queries that you can email to us once you've made your final workbook submission. A quick example might be a provider planning to take an extra intake of students in January. The resulting increase in the number of new entrants on Table 5 may trigger a credibility warning, And that same increase may also mean that thresholds for differences between values on various comparison tables are exceeded, resulting in one or more fields being highlighted. Initial explanations are not mandatory, but using them to address any first stage credibility warnings and comparison table highlighting at an early stage can speed up the data verification process. They effectively become the first round of data verification queries. An email identifying factors lying behind these issues could be sent as initial explanations to dataVerification@HESES24.org.uk as soon as you've submitted your final workbook submission. There's no predefined format for these, but please refer to them clearly and clearly reference the relevant part of the workbook. We are almost at the next Q&A section, but just before we get there, we're going to have a quick look at how to get your HESES submission signed off. So getting the sign off of your data is what we're aiming for through the entire process. It's worth re-emphasizing the importance of this because it represents the data that will be used in calculating the grant allocations for the next academic year, which are published in the spring or early summer. The HESES sign-off form is sent when our queries have been resolved and any amendments to the data in the workbook have been processed. It shows a submission number and the date from the information sheet on your workbook, and it's very important that you check the submission date and number shown on the form correspond to the most recent submission to the portal. This is what connects your sign-off to the workbooks and its data. The sign-off must be returned by the final sign-off deadline, which for HESES24 is the 31st of January 2025. The sign-off must be by the provider's accountable officer. If it's anticipated they will not be available, please let us know as soon as possible. Additionally, if there is an expected change to an accountable officer, sometimes that happens around the new calendar year, please make us aware of this accordingly. We'll need to prepare a new sign-off form for you. We expect the data we use will be the final version submitted and signed off as correct by your provider's accountable officer. Sometimes errors are identified in our data after it has been signed off or even after the IRFS has used the data. Signed off data can be amended, but will only accept amendments to the final submitted data in exceptional circumstances. To be accepted for an amendment, errors must be widespread and significant, relate to clear evidence of data error rather than reinterpretation of data, and be likely to have a material impact on one or more of our uses of the data. A data amendment panel will assess errors using information provided to them and then decide or recommend whether we require the errors to be corrected. If you believe that your data may need to be amended after sign-off, please contact us straight away. For further details, please see our website, and the email address, and the URL address is www.office4students.org.uk/data-analysis/amendments-2-data. Okay, so this is time for our next Q&A round. So I'll invite Graham back into the fold. So we'll see if you're there, Graham. And after this Q&A, we're going to be having a look at multiplication factors.
I am indeed here. I'm just waiting again for the video to catch up with the audio. There we go.
Wonderful.
We have had a question I'm hoping a colleague will respond to while I will answer the first couple of questions we've had. We have had a question about how the HESES return is compared to the individualized data that we get. So the particular question asks for the data futures student record, but obviously the same applies in the ILR data as well. Basically, detail on this, on the algorithms we use to apply to the individualized data and produce a HESES comparison workbook is available under the data and analysis section of our website, and there's a section called data checking tools. And this sets out all the various algorithms that we use to recreate a HESES. And then, of course, when it comes to the comparison tables within the HESES return, that my colleague has just talked through, in terms of the comparison data, we sort of utilize those algorithms and that data to populate those
Have
tables
a look
with the relevant. You're you're not muted, Will. Your populated those tables will get populated with the relevant data that we can then use to compare. So obviously, we will identify things like mode, so full time or part time, the level of courses, so whether or not they're undergraduate or postgraduate taught, or what type of postgraduate. So that's how it is, and obviously the information is there under the data section of our website. We have had another question about what is needed post sign-off actions and year end. Regarding this question, not entirely sure what this question was looking for, whether or not that's what actions the OFS does after the sign-off of HESES, or whether or not that's asking if there are any actions that a provider might need to take after the sign-off of HESES. So I'm hoping that that particular person is here and is able to expand on that question in either the Q&A box or the chat, and we can hopefully then address it. Or if not, happy for you to fire it to us by email and ask the question, and we can respond to it that way. And finally, the last question, which is one that came in during the webinar, we've had a question about the results package containing a number of files and clarifying what those files are and how they should be looking at them. When it comes to the HESES results package from the OFS portal, my understanding is that there is only the HESES workbook in that file. Not sure whether or not the particular submitter is referencing another results package from another return on that may be made either to the OFS, or whether or not that's the output that's coming out from the data checking tool on HESA and the ILR. But for the HESES one, there is only the HESES workbook in it, as I understand. And finally, a last question, which has literally just come in regarding DVQs. The DVQs, it's asking when sort of the period for DVQs and when they're sent. The DVQs are sent within the verification period for HESES. So that takes place from the submission of the HESES workbook to us. So there's obviously the two deadlines, one for colleges and one for all other providers. And then the verification takes place up until the end of January 2025 for HESES24, at which point, hopefully, all queries or credibility checks have been answered and the data is signed off. And then obviously we can then utilize that data in our funding calculations beyond then. And obviously in the HESES workbook this year, there is the multiplication factors representations workbooks, where any representations need to be made, but more will be coming from my colleague Will on that imminently.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Graham. And apologies for speaking over you there. To anyone watching our webinar, I must have had a bit of a jitter with my internet, and I thought Graham had frozen, but it would appear that I had frozen. Either way, I'm back now. Apologies for any confusion during that. We are, as Graham said, coming into our final section on multiplication factors, which I'm sure is a part of the webinar which everyone has been looking forward to, as it's a new process. So, multiplication factors, what are they? We've mentioned them a few times. This is our last section, and we're going to look at how to submit representations as well as what they are. So for a bit of background, the OFS provides funding on the basis of student activity of eligible students on courses recognised as higher education for OFS funding purposes. For many years now, we've used HESES data as a proxy for determining student activity. Up until HESES23, HESES collections included a count of the number of students that were not expected to complete their intended study intentions for the year, previously known as non-completions, and part-time study intensity. These were applied to columns 1 and 2 in HESES to get a final full-time equivalence, or FTE. If you look back at previous HESES returns, you'll see places for this data to be collected in what was previously called columns 3 and 4A. And these are no longer present in the HESES workbook. For HESES23, we removed the requirement to return non-completions and part-time study intensity, meaning HESES data no longer gave us an FTE. To give appropriate figures, we introduced multiplication factors in the sector, and there's data. We did this process after HESES and used a separate workbook for it. So please note that that is the case in previous years. Following the representations, the final factors were agreed using to convert HESES data into funding FTEs. So last year, we published the factors, and you were able to make representations to us if you felt that the calculated factors were no longer appropriate. Once they had been agreed, we used these to determine our funding for 24-25. For HESES24, we wanted to try and reduce the burden on providers, and so have decided to bring the HESES survey and multiplication factors representations processes together. While we'll still deal with the HESES survey data separately, we have combined the workbooks for the returns to run the process in parallel. The HESES24 workbook will have all the usual tables, but will also include corresponding FTE tables for tables 1, 2, 3, 6A, and 6C. These will show your HESES24 data, the multiplication factors being applied, and the forecast FTE. There will also be a place to submit representations if you believe the multiplication factors are no longer appropriate. We will also include a series of indicative funding tables to show how changes to multiplication factors may impact your funding. These tables are not there to predict funding for the future, but they're there as tools to help you make representations. They're based on the 24-25 funding methods, and so do not represent an accurate picture of what your provider will receive in 25-26. If you believe one of the agreed multiplication factors from 23-24 is no longer an appropriate reflection of your provider's provision, you can submit representations using the HESES24 workbook. And we'll have a look at that in a moment. However, it's important to note this is not compulsory, but if you choose to make representations, they need to be submitted by noon on the 14th of February, 2025. HESES now effectively is a headcount of students through the model using years of engagement. The OFS funding method uses provider FTE as part of our calculations for allocations, so we need a way to convert raw counts of years of engagement into FTE. Applying the multiplication factors allows us to do this. And for this year, to start with, we're using the agreed multiplication factors in 23-24 for 24-25. We do understand that provider provision has changed and can change from year to year. And so you'll be able to submit representations on individual multiplication factors where it is thought that these are no longer appropriate. So let's take a quick look at a few examples of this process. Here we have a screenshot of the representations table as they will appear in the HESES24 workbook. Tables 1, 2, 3, 6A, and 6C will all have corresponding worksheets for providers to submit representations. All the tables will look the same and are called FTE 1 full-time, FTE 2 part-time, FTE 2 is sandwich around FTE 3 part-time, and so on. The only exception to the layout will be tables 6A and 6C, which will be categorized by profession instead of price group to mimic the layout on tables 6A and C. The representation tables have two distinct sections. The first section will display the countable years of engagement you have input into the HESES24 workbook, the multiplication factor which will be applied, and the final forecast FTE based on the years of engagement and the multiplication factor. If the data input in HESES24 is new this year and so had no corresponding data in HESES23, we'll also display something in level. And this is the level of which we'll be using to apply a new multiplication factor. All the information on levels and how the multiplication factors have been determined can be found in Appendix 6 on the HESES pages. And again, this will be published over the coming days. The second section is where providers will submit representations. You will need to suggest a new multiplication factor and then explain why this is more appropriate to use. A calculation of the FTE based on the proposed multiplication factor will also be given. The representation process is designed to determine where there's been a substantial change from previous years, which could have a material impact on a provider's funding. As such, representations will need to meet some criteria in order to be considered. Firstly, representations must result in a predicted change to the funding based on the indicative funding tables contained within the representations workbook of at least £100,000, or a predicted change to funding based on the indicative funding tables contained within the representations workbook of at least 10% of a provider's total funding allocation in 24-25. The indicative funding tables will be included in the workbook, so you can see this change. The indicative funding is not a forecast of what you will receive, but is based on the 24-25 funding methods. However, it can provide a guide as to how changes to factors may impact on funding. As well as the financial thresholds, representations on multiplication factors being applied to price group A must be a change to the factor of at least 0.02 or larger to be considered for the representations process. For representations on multiplication factors being applied to price groups B, C1.1, C1.2, C2, and D, changes to multiplication factors must be at least 0.05 or larger to be considered for the representations process. If representations are made on a change to a factor smaller than these thresholds, they will not be considered. Here we have an example of a provider with 237 years of engagement in price group B, standard UG other, and 53 years of engagement for PGT master's loan. The multiplication factors agreed in 23-24 have been applied, and we can see the provider has chosen to submit representations in relation to the multiplication factor applied to UG other. For this representation, we can see the provider has suggested a new multiplication factor of 0.93. Where we have provider explanation is where you will provide a short narrative as to why the new figure is more appropriate. This may be a good point to note what we're looking for as clear reasoning why the new factor is more appropriate when compared to 23-24. For example, this particular case could be because price group B provision is made up of many courses. In this case, the provider may state that they've closed a course which previously had higher dropout rates, and so believe the new multiplication factor is more accurate as a reflection of their provision than the 0.87 previously applied, which included the now closed course. While we don't need detailed sums, we do need providers to give us a brief explanation as how they came to the new figure. Other examples may include opening a new course and using data from a comparable course already derived. If we have a look at the PGT Master's Loan section, we see that the multiplication factor here was different to that from the previous year. This may be because the provision is new. The OFS has determined that the level 2 multiplication factor was appropriate to apply, and so this is shown. On this occasion, the provider has chosen not to submit a representation because they believe the multiplication factor given is a reasonable forecast of their provision at this level for 24-25 academic year. As such, the remaining section remains greyed out. Once you have finalized your representations, you will submit them via the HESES24 section of the portal. So while you can submit representations at any point through the HESES process, we would strongly recommend submitting them after the HESES24 sign-off deadline. That is to say, between the 1st of February and the 14th of February, 2025. This is because we'll use the latest version of the representations we have received by the 14th of February, 2025. If you submit representations with your HESES24 data before the HESES sign-off date and an amendment is required, you'll need to ensure the representations included in the new workbook remain accurate. By waiting until after the HESES sign-off deadline has passed, this means you will know the data will remain static and also allows you to focus on the HESES24 data verification period up until the 31st of January. HESES24 data will not be amendable after the 31st of January 2025. So even if you include a change in your workbook after the HESES deadline, it will not be pulled through into our official figures. So all of your HESES data needs to be finalized and signed off by the 31st of January 2025. Representations will not be reviewed until after the final deadline. So it's not a matter of getting them in early. And the final deadline is noon on the 14th of February, 2025. This is for inclusion in the initial 25-26 grant announcement. As a quick reminder then, you can submit representations at any point in the HESES process after the census date, but only the latest version of the workbook will be used. We have combined the workbooks together to allow the most up-to-date HESES data to inform any representations you make. With this in mind, we'd recommend focusing on the HESES24 return and then submitting representations between the 1st of February and the 14th of February, 2025. And we've hit our final Q&A section for the day. So once again, I'm going to invite Graham in to see if anything else has come in for us to answer.
We've only had one further question, which is in relation to the DVQ queries and noting that some, such as queries on apprenticeships, can be complex to fix and answer. Our responses to this is we are aware that some areas of a return can be complex to address, including areas such as apprenticeships. And obviously, we're understanding of that when it comes to the process. That's why we recommend engaging with the process, the data verification process early, and obviously liaising with our DV team, where either responses may take longer to complete if you need to seek out the relevant information to the question that's been asked, or where you may need to make revisions to your HESES workbook to upload through the OFS portal in light of the dialogue that's taking place through the queries and responses. We're here to work with you through the data verification process to obviously ensure that any submission is accurate, and obviously to give us the assurance that the data that's signed off at the end of the process is obviously suitable for us to use in areas such as the funding calculations. So again, just engage with us early through the process, and we're here to help. It's all the questions I've got either from the Q&A or the chat at the moment. But obviously, if anyone does have any further questions following this webinar, our team is here. So use the emails provided through the webinars to send any questions you may have in, and we will get to them where we can.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And as you say that, Graham, a question has come in. So can you separate out the FTE and non-completion parts of the multiplication factor? So no, you can't at the moment. The multiplication factors are designed to reflect both of those. And in your representations, I think you would just provide an explanation as to why, if you were to propose a new one, the new multiplication factor would be appropriate. The full-time multiplication factors, all the FTE for that will be 1. And so they are more focused for full-time on non-completions, whereas the part-time multiplication factors do consider both of those areas. I think if you have detailed questions on multiplication factors or anything specific to your provider, I'd recommend emailing us with the email that we've provided, heses@officeforstudents.org.uk. and we'll be able to go into a bit more detail with you there. Now, I wonder, just before we move on to our final few slides, if I could invite Graham back in quickly, and also Roger, if Roger is around. I know that we've been having a few little technical difficulties, but hopefully Roger can turn his camera on. Wonderful. So I thought it would be good quickly just to say to everyone, you will have seen us over the past few weeks, but we are the funding team for the recurrent funding at the OFS. So myself, Will, we've got Graham, and we've got Roger as well. So when you email into HESES at Office for Students, we're the team who deal with it, and we're the team who lead on the data verification process. So hopefully that helps you put a face or multiple faces to multiple names, and know that, as Graham said, we're here to help get this process run through quickly. As I've been talking, one more question has come in, but I believe Graham is going to answer that in the Q&A itself. So thank you very much, Graham. I'll let you both go and won't keep you dawdling on screen too much longer. So thank you very much, and we'll move on to our final few slides. So, how to find out more? So you can go to the website, which is www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, HESES. If you have any other questions or feedback, you can email us at heses@officeforstudents.org.uk. And you can also find the videos on the website, on the events page, and also there's information on our YouTube channel as well. So that brings us to the end of our final training webinar for the HESES24 process. Thank you so much for joining us, and please do feel free to get in contact if you have any questions. For the time being, that's all from us. So we hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll be in touch soon. Goodbye.